You're still watching All Angles with myself, Mfundo Mabalani. Now, the DA, Afriforum and Helen Suzman Foundation is challenging Jacob Zuma's medical parole. Their application is being heard by the High Court in Pretoria. They want the parole reviewed and set aside. Zuma was granted medical parole in September for his 2-year contempt sentence. eNCA's Barry Bateman is following the matter and joins us now. Barry, good morning. I know that the DA has filed its arguments. On what basis exactly are they trying to have Zuma's medical parole reviewed and set aside?
Yeah, good morning. So there's two approaches to this. Firstly, on a legality perspective and on a rationality perspective. On the legality one, it comes down to the interpretation. We've heard a lot about this in this morning's argument. The interpretation of Section 79 of the Correctional Services Act. And this relates to parole, but including medical parole. And Section 79(1)(a) of the Act sets out basically the conditions that the applicant, in this case, former President Jacob Zuma, would have to present with in order to qualify to be granted such parole. And in this case, we're talking somebody who has got a terminal illness or in such a way so incapacitated that they would no longer be able to stay in prison. Looking at that particular matter, they say, and then we also we heard about the authority of Arthur Fraser, who ultimately granted this medical parole. They're saying that Arthur Fraser, firstly, he did not have the authority to make that assessment that is required for Section 79(1)(a). So he's not a doctor. He does not have that authority, while he does have the authority in terms of the Act to be able to make a determination on medical parole. He could not make the assessment on the medical status of the applicant, in this case, Mr. Zuma. So on that particular aspect, the rationality, or the legality rather, of this decision to grant Zuma parole falls flat. We also moved on to the other aspect, and we looked at when such medical assessments were conducted on the former president. And you'll recall when he was submitted to or admitted to the Correctional Services facility. Remember those pictures that came out of him being assessed by Correctional Services officials and so on? That is a standard procedure. They do a health check on every inmate that is admitted to a particular facility. And nowhere in that particular assessment is there any finding of, and there's a list of, and we learned about the sub-regulations in this particular act, that Zuma presented with the terminal illnesses or the likes that would have been found that he would have been incapacitated. But the DA in their submissions also pointed out that days before being admitted to the prison, he had a press conference. Or it was actually hours before. He had a press conference at eNCA where he was combative, was the term that was used. He seemed quite fine. He was then admitted to prison. It was then a couple of days later he suddenly developed this condition and his condition deteriorated. But they point out that immediately after his release on medical parole, he was out and about again. He was spotted at a casino. So you've got to ask your question about, well, how was it found? Even if you accept that Arthur Fraser is able to make this particular decision related to granting medical parole, it doesn't bear, it's not borne out in the facts of the conduct of Mr. Zuma. So these are some of the grounds that have been advanced so far on why this decision to grant him medical parole should be reviewed and set aside.
No, this case is certainly a very interesting one. But what would be the remedy in this case? Because Zuma is already eligible for normal parole at this point.
You're quite right. And it was a question that Matojane, the justice, hearing this particular matter, put to Advocate Jamie, who is representing the DA in the matter. But the way it was argued by Advocate Jamie is that, because the question, from the justice was, would he remit this back to the parole board? The response to that would be no, because even though he would be eligible for a normal parole application, no such application exists at this moment. We are here dealing with a medical parole decision that is to be reviewed and set aside. It wasn't said explicitly, but my understanding of this is that if the medical parole is found to be unlawful or irrational and is reviewed and set aside, the net effect of that would be that former President Jacob Zuma would have to report back to prison. He would then have to file a fresh application for normal parole. Until such time, no such application exists.
No, it remains very interesting. Thank you very much. That's reporter Barry Bateman talking to us on that particular case. Now, don't expect